Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by High Tech Answers and Healthcare Now Radio, part of the Answers Media Network, and is sponsored by the law offices of Myrick O'Connell. Now here is your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Grace Cordovano, founder of Enlightening Results. Welcome, Grace.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, it's great to have you on, and what I always like to do before diving into the main part of the discussion is to give my guests a chance to give a bit broader introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So the floor is yours, Grace.
Great, terrific. So I'm Grace Cordovano. I'm a board-certified patient advocate specializing in the oncology space. My day-to-day is working with patients and their care partners from point of diagnosis through survivorship or end-of-life care planning. And what I do is really almost personalized medicine, understanding what a patient's unmet needs are, their challenges, their goals, and connecting them to the information and tools they need to make an empowered and educated decision about their care.
So, and I definitely want to explore what that role fully entails and kind of what goes into it. But is the patient advocacy side of things what brought you into the healthcare industry, or kind of what first made you interested in wanting to get into healthcare?
That's a loaded question, but I'm happy to answer it. So I'm going to start by saying that I didn't speak English as a child. My family is from Poland, and while I was born here, I was highly encouraged to speak Polish at home. When I started school, it took a little bit to get the hang of English speaking, but when I did, I became the go-to child navigator as a 10 and 12-year-old, attending doctor appointments and visits with family and friends who had immigrated here from Europe, who didn't speak English and didn't really have access to health insurance. I'd be sitting there with an encyclopedia kind of translating what was going on and making sense of all of this. I always loved science, was a big fan of Mr. Wizard as a kid, so I'm dating myself here. But I wanted to do some type of science research and eventually decided on looking to do research in cancer. One of the driving forces behind this was my mom, on her first mammogram, which I encouraged her to go to, was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of breast cancer. And I could not believe that there wasn't a cure. Here in America, and coming from an immigrant family where this was the land of opportunity, how could there not be a medicine or cure for this? And I wanted to understand why. So my mom is a breast cancer survivor, and I was motivated to go on to grad school to understand biochemistry of metabolic disease, why things go wrong, and understanding drug development and chemoprevention, really. And eventually I got a cancer diagnosis, which I received the diagnosis of advanced lymphoma, which 4.5 months later, after being a patient at Sloan, after undergoing multiple tests, procedures, biopsies, surgery, being placed in isolation for potential tuberculosis, turned out to be a misdiagnosis and a fungal infection that I had acquired on my honeymoon. And that was a really big pivotal point for me, because here I was, I spoke the language, I had health insurance, I had a PhD in biochemistry, I worked in the city, walking distance from a cancer center of excellence, I had family, I had a position that allowed me to flexibility to attend appointments and work from home when I was recovering, and the diagnosis brought me to my knees. And I wondered, with all the privilege that I have and support, if I can't do it, what does everybody else do? And this background of being an immigrant, part of an immigrant family, not speaking the language, not having access to healthcare was very pivotal as well. I learned about patient advocacy as a profession in a newspaper article, and it was as if the stars aligned, and that's what I was committed to doing. And I opened my own practice, which is called Enlightening Results, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That is quite a story, and kind of the beginning part of it, which, as you said, is becoming basically the family translator. It unfortunately is not that uncommon of a story, I think, when you're considering patient populations where you have kind of first generation immigrants where the parents don't necessarily speak English, and and they lean on their children. So I have a friend from law school who was in the exact same position. I know this is probably a little bit far afield from where we thought we'd go, but do you see any improvements in trying to recognize that children really should not be placed into that type of a situation?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a huge unmet need. I'm extremely sympathetic to it because I've lived it, and the helplessness. And imagine as a child and as an immigrant starting in a new place, in a new country where you don't understand the language or the nuances and the healthcare system and the laws to try to navigate this on your own. It's mind-blowing. And I see this unmet need now repeating itself as we move into digital health and digital tech. And something that's triggering for me is when I hear, oh, well, these populations aren't really tech savvy, or they don't really want this technology. They don't really want this access to data. We are so wrong, because if the patient isn't tech savvy or interested in data, there could be a care partner, a spouse, a child, a friend, a colleague that's a heat-seeking missile and will do anything to help that person. So a lot of strong feelings there because I can relate to it personally, but also professionally. We're making some big mistakes and we need to do better.
No, that is definitely a good point. And sometimes I wonder if the assertion that, patients or even sometimes you hear their caregivers aren't interested in the technology is maybe a smokescreen for the clinician or the organization not wanting to have to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. It's hard. This is not easy stuff. It's going to require partnership with patients and care partners because there's definitely a population of patients who are super empowered, who are laser focused, who are so engaged in their care, who have been there, done that, and then some, and have peer-to-peer health support groups and communities that they relay all this information to. But we're not doing a really good job supporting those super engaged patients who are engaged in their care already and can disseminate and filter those nuggets of information and those findings to other people when they're perhaps newly diagnosed or just starting in their trajectory.
So do you have suggestions on how that process could be improved?
We need to start including patients and their care partners in this whole life cycle of innovation, in these conversations when we're at conferences, at healthcare conferences, not one or two patients that perhaps I've seen progress maybe on stage speaking, but if we're supposed to be consumers, where are we on the floor in attendance to ask questions, to take notes, to be able to mingle and learn and touch and feel some of these innovations that are on the exhibit halls? There's such an opportunity that's missed also online. Point of care is no longer where the doctor is. It's where the patients are. And patients are online. They're on social media. They're on Twitter. They're on tweet chats. They're writing blog posts and on their websites and holding meetups. And we are, as an ecosystem, so far behind in how we can partner with patients to disseminate information. We haven't even scratched the surface.
No, and kind of all those different sources that you're talking about, I know I only see a small portion of it through the social media use that I'm involved in, but kind of the expansiveness and, I think kind of your overview of it just shows how many different areas it's in. What do you think could be done to encourage that collaboration and that coordination, and coming from the perspective of thinking that, if you're looking at the physicians or other clinicians, they're being told you only have so many minutes to see a patient, which arguably goes against what they want to be doing, but you have organizations, kind of pushing that type of a framework.
It's interesting from a clinician standpoint. So I attend doctor appointments. That's part of my work. I attend with patients and I take notes and ask questions. But something that I do is prime the patient for those encounters. So there's no course on being a professional patient. There's no degree. There's no webinar or seminar or certificate program, you are dragged and dropped. And if you get a life-altering diagnosis, you basically have to hope for the worst and try to get up to speed as quickly as possible and hope that you at least float, if not survive and make it to shore. Simple things would be some simple solutions from my point of view is teach the patient how to make the most use of their 8 minutes with the doctor. It's not enough to show up. I tell my patients all the time, it's not enough to just show up and sit down in the seat. How can you lean in? Prepare some questions. What's keeping you up at night? What do you have no idea about? How are you feeling? Why didn't you refill that drug? Are you actively experiencing fatigue, nausea, and vomiting? Do you have uncontrolled anxiety? There's so many solutions that we can quickly connect patients to and improve that doctor-patient relationship. There's something magical that I see transpire when I'm in a clinical encounter, when a patient is prepared with, and maybe they have a loved one or a care partner with them. They start to control the conversation or engage in the conversation, and the doctor and the nurse lean forward. They enjoy this. This is what brought them to medicine, being in a partnership and having this conversation. A lot of my colleagues in medicine say sometimes they'll, come from a discussion where they did deliver something traumatic and they're not sure how it was received. The patient literally might sit there, not ask a question, not say anything, completely deer in headlights look, and they worry what happens to that person when they leave their clinic. Many patients are afraid to ask questions. We have to teach people how to come prepared to that encounter. And that's something that I feel we can do with technology, with point of care marketing materials and educational materials that are in the waiting room, in the exam room, to infomercials or tutorials that are on Twitter. Lots of opportunity ripe with a lot of low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, and it only seems natural to be asking questions because, I think in most parts of our daily lives, most of us are fairly inquisitive and we're asking questions. We're not just accepting things. So, kind of what I'm picking up from what you're describing is it's really driving a cultural shift because historically it
Absolutely.
kind of was, it was, historically that kind of setup of just listen to whatever the physician is telling you, and that arguably is not really aligned with how almost anything operates nowadays.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely a cultural shift from the traditional doctor knows best, doctor only knows best, 1950s type medicine, paternalistic, to this model of participatory medicine and shared decision making where the patient and their family want to be a part of the conversation, want to contribute and share their life experiences and meet the physician in the middle. And in many cases, they want to share these things so that the doctor has a better understanding of who they are as a person, what their life is like, and living with that diagnosis. We can't just focus on the clinical. It has to be what I call life-focused care, life-focused treatment planning.
And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Grace Cordovano from Enlightening Results. We're talking about the relationship between patients and clinicians. And, Grace, some of what we were just talking about is, making sure that the patient is prepared and ready to ask questions and kind of get targeted. Mm-hmm. Maybe flipping the script on that a little bit, what could physicians do to encourage their patients to come prepared with these questions, or to understand that there is the openness to having this real dialogue?
Mm-hmm. I think something that I have a privilege of knowing because of the work that I do is, there's this whole challenge of clinician burnout and moral injury. And I think when patients in many cases come see their physician, they're not at their best. And they're hoping that this person will have the silver bullet and help them and is the healer and the God or the silver bullet in what all their struggles are. I think we need to be more open from a clinical standpoint and say that these are the realities where we are really pressed for time. I only have this amount of time, but I want to make sure we cover everything for the next appointment, here's some tips. Can we write these things down, or let's focus on what's keeping you up at night. A question like that, it can be something that can be very eye-opening and saying, I'm afraid of my upcoming PET scan. I'm afraid that because of the nausea and vomiting or these headaches, I won't be able to parent. I'm afraid that if I go for this surgical procedure, I'm not going to be able to take care of my elderly mother. Those nuggets of information can transform the entire conversation to come up with a logical, strategic plan as to how we're going to get this patient to their next step.
Yeah, and it seems like if you start those types of questions, they're going to snowball because you're always going to be kind of, as you said, thinking strategically and thinking about how do we progress, as opposed to, just using up the time quickly, probably too quickly, of trying to just think about where things are and what happened in the past, but really to shift it so there is a full continuity of care.
Mm-hmm. I think patients also need to recognize there needs to be some ownership in why am I coming to this appointment? Like really, really prime it as if you're coming to a business meeting. You wouldn't show up to a business meeting unprepared. You have to take this same step to prepare for this appointment. Sometimes patients don't even know why they're at an appointment. They have appointments scheduled and they're not sure and they show up, and that doesn't help the dialogue. So we need to focus on how we can best prime patients and their loved ones for these encounters to really make the most use of the time, but also to come up with a plan to make sure that the patient leaves is crystal clear and can be engaged in their care.
Understanding why they're coming in for a visit definitely makes sense. And how do you see that connecting to the fact that, and this is something that I hear from my wife who's a physician, is a patient will book a visit for a particular reason and then walk in the room and want to talk about 10 other wholly unrelated things that she wants to be able to help with, but will take a significant amount of time and will go well beyond the amount of time that's been allotted. So it seems like that is kind of a corollary to what we've been talking about in terms of being prepared to focus and know why you're coming in, but also to be honest about if you're making an appointment about the scope of things that you want to be doing.
Mm-hmm. And I'm so sympathetic to that. I really don't know how physicians do the work that they do, because I certainly can relate. Just because you have a cancer diagnosis doesn't mean all of your other ailments, symptoms, and problems wash away and are erased and you get a get out of jail free card. I do see that patients say, you know what, but I've been having chest pains, but I'm having, terrible heartburn, or I am having suicidal thoughts. These are real problems that can't be ignored. And the doctor has a full schedule of patients that are just as in much need of their time. So what do? I'll give you some insights into how I guide this. And this is why I think everyone would benefit from having an advocate. And there's so much we can do with digital health and digital technology to help prepare patients to write these down, to take a minute and pause and see what's going on, what am I feeling, to recognize that my oncologist isn't going to manage my diabetes, that we need a care team. And I would love to see more facilities being multidisciplinary, multi-specialty, working together. And in order for that to happen, we need to have interoperability where that data is readily and records are readily accessible, so that a patient can see multiple people, multiple specialists, and they have access to that health record, because that's what's so important and often a rate limiting step in the work that I do.
And thinking about that access to data concern, is it a business issue that's causing this or something else? Because, I think you and I are probably both fairly well versed in the background of what the law allows. And a lot of what you hear in terms of not wanting to share information or give individuals access is frankly directly contrary to what the law requires.
I have to say that there's excellent work being done from a regulatory and policy standpoint. Just at the beginning of this year at HIMSS, there was a big announcement, HHS, ONC, CMS, So there's a new rule, no more data blocking. Patients will have access to their information. This is the law. You have a right to your information, to request your records in a format that you wish, and to, not be ridiculously charged hundreds of dollars, a reasonable fee for processing. And it seems that we're moving in the right direction, but it's slow. There is no doubt in my mind that this is a matter of priorities. Data blocking has manifested to the level that we're seeing it now because of priorities. There's a difference between business priorities and actual patient care priorities. Because if patient care priorities were the main priority, we wouldn't have fax machines. We wouldn't have data blocking and portals and information that's siloed. We wouldn't need patients to go and in person take a day off from work and pick up their medical records, a paper copy, to bring it to another office. So I have to push back and say that we're not doing a good job with priorities. There's definitely room for improvement, but the whole concept of information blocking and data blocking, if we can get rid of that in our local communities, would be huge. Add in also transparency. We've moved light years ahead of HIPAA 1996 with digital and mobile and all the different machine learning and AI and technologies and digital tech and digital health that we have today. I don't think anyone anticipated where we are now when we were thinking about business models and transparency. But patients want to know what is happening with their data. They want to understand human data science. They want to participate. They want to have a choice. They want to be able to give an informed consent, a transparent consent, really understand what they're signing up for, or to opt out. And this is real. And the major pushback is, well, data aggregation and de-identification are business as usual, and it's all HIPAA compliant, and everyone's doing it, so it's going to be this way. This practice erodes trust, and if we want to talk about advancing digital health and technology and really moving to Health 3.0, we're not going to get there without building partnerships and trust with people living with the diagnosis.
And the real kind of concept of building partnerships, from my perspective, that aligns with the overall transformation that's trying to occur in healthcare of moving into a more quality focus. Because I think if you look at the old fee-for-service world, which I think we all say old, but very much still exists, it encourages those silos. Whereas if you're looking at a value-based care model, it really does need to become that cohesive and collaborative approach that you were describing.
And something from a value-based standpoint, so fee-for-service, very clinical parameters, not really life-focused, quality of life focused. And I think that there's a huge difference between the two. And these components need to be weighed when we make treatment decisions. When we talk about end of life, or actually the fact that we don't talk about end of life, that we don't plan for the only inevitable thing that's for certain is that we're all going to die one day. With introduction of something like palliative care earlier into a life-altering diagnosis treatment plan can address whole person care. There's so many things that seem simple and straightforward to me and patients and loved ones that are going through this. It's a matter of priorities, reimbursement, and policies, as well as educational efforts so that people are informed. And we need that trust and transparency so people can make these educated decisions about their care and ultimately their life. That's really what's at stake.
No, I definitely agree. And it's a point that I've come back to with a number of people, which is we have to include everybody in these discussions. It's, all these different transformative or innovative ideas, oftentimes it's, even then in the development, just one segment thinking about it. It's not, okay, let's bring all of the players to the table. And by all the players, I mean patients, physicians, the developers, insurance, like everyone should be working together. And it still feels as if there is reluctance to do that.
Agreed. I'm going to add in nurses as well, because nurses are rock stars, and they're often not at the table as well.
No, that is very true, and I think it's to that point, it is really you want to be as broad and as inclusive as you can. At this point in time, trying to exclude anyone just doesn't make sense.
Agreed. Bad business strategy.
Yes, and it's hopefully if it's a bad business strategy, that will start to show through in the business results, because if you're looking at it from a business standpoint, once you're not making the same profit or generating the same type of business, then you start to shift, or you start planning ahead to shift, because it's you're not going to continue, or you hope you're not going to continue down a path where it just leads you to failure.
Agreed.
Believe it or not, we are already getting very close to the end of our time. So what I'd like to do is close with one final extremely broad question, which is, if you had a magic wand, what immediate change would you like to make to the healthcare system? And obviously, I think we're focusing on the American healthcare system.
So many choices to pick from, but I'm going to answer with removing data blocking and increasing transparency, boots on the ground in our local communities. Every patient who needs access to their medical records, whether it's their health record, whether it's information from remote patient monitoring, or they're looking for transparency from their healthcare provider or facility as to where their information has been shared or sold, or being able to correct a mistake that they found in their medical record. I would love for those 4 things to be removed, and that's something that I'm working on dedicated to in my venture of Unblock Health, hoping to give patients a self-advocacy tool that they can report these things, boots on the ground, so that we can measure it and then bring attention to regulatory and policymakers and decision makers to show them the realities that patients are struggling with, boots on the ground.
I definitely hope that progress is made on that front, and very quickly. But kind of, as I already said, believe it or not, we are out of time already. I want to thank my guest, Grace Cordovano, for a great conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you have a great day.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.